Hello, friends. I'm so glad you've joined us to open God's Word together. I had a birthday recently, and I've reached the age where now I'm the one saying, well, when I was a kid, because so many things have changed. I remember when we literally had to dial a phone. Hey, I'm not that old. Well, that's better. I remember literally rolling down the car window. And I remember when we used to get lost. A lot. I drove for decades before smartphones and satellites brought GPS into our cars. We had maps on paper, but mostly we just memorized where we were going. When we got lost, we didn't have phones to call anyone, so we'd either turn around or just keep going until we found something we recognized or someone we could ask for directions. My kids couldn't find their way out of a parking lot with a paper map, but they never get lost because they have GPS. Even if they miss a turn, the computer instantly recalculates to the next fastest route, which is definitely safer than what we used to do. But the transition to GPS wasn't safe at all. In the early days, digital map data wasn't reliable. So occasionally your smartphone would send you in the wrong direction. Like the time that my GPS instructed me to get off the highway abruptly and led me through an entire clover leaf of exit ramps before directing me right back on the road in which I was already on. Most of the time, this was just a delay. But sometimes, it could be deadly. Like when Google Maps instructed a man in Minneapolis to drive across the Mississippi River in the middle of a winter night on what was actually a footbridge, and he plunged into the water. Or the time that Amber Van Hecke tried to get to the Grand Canyon, but GPS sent her down a road through the desert that didn't exist. After running out of gas, she was stranded in the middle of nowhere for 5 days and nearly died. Or at the time, people on the way to Denver Airport were directed down an unfinished dirt road after a rainstorm that trapped hundreds of cars in the mud. In those days, simply following your GPS could lead you to the last place you wanted to go. And there was a long time I felt that way about following God. Currently, we're in a sermon series studying one of the most beloved scriptures in the entire Bible, Psalm 23. Last week, Pastor Megan talked about how, in contrast to many of the other leaders and trends we too quickly follow, God is the good shepherd who loves us and leads us into green pastures besides quiet waters. Sounds pristine. But my experience has been that more than once, God has led me where I didn't want to go, down into some of the darkest valleys of my life. A lot of people have idealized ideas about adoption, and some adoption stories are like that. Michelle and I had several stories like that, and if I'm being honest, we had idealized ideas about adoption too. So after 3 relatively easy adoptions, when a doctor we knew contacted us about 3 orphaned teenagers she'd met who just arrived from a refugee camp in Africa and asked if we'd take them, we said yes. Not immediately. We prayed about it. We asked others for wisdom. That doctor promised to pay for all their medical and tutoring fees because these kids had never been to a school in any language, so there was some catching up to do and a lifetime of deferred maintenance medically. It took a few days and a truly miraculous intervention to convince us that God was with us in this. Not just with us, leading us to do this. So we did. We followed God into the unknown. There were so many unanswered questions, but we had faith that God would take care of all of us if we simply followed him. Green pastures and quiet waters like Pastor Megan talked about. And as if to confirm our faith, the first day after they came to live with us, a second miraculous interaction proved that God really was with us, doing things beyond what we could have ever thought of to ask for or imagine. It was hard, of course. We didn't speak each other's languages. But in other ways, it was also a honeymoon period for all of us. But over time, it got harder. Coming out of a war zone and surviving as orphans for 9 years on their own, They'd experienced traumas that were beyond what I could have conceived of. And they brought that with them, of course. We should have seen that coming. We simply lacked the imagination for that degree of tragedy. But there were other things that we didn't see coming as well. When we called the doctor about the medical and tutoring bills for the second year, she explained that recently God had called her to support another ministry with her finances instead. I thought we were in this together. But suddenly we were on our own with fees we had no way to pay. At that point, we were midway through building an addition onto our house to make room for all of us. And a few of you know what happened next. First, a support beam in the basement collapsed and our entire house cracked apart as half of it dropped about 6 inches, and we had to move out immediately. How would we ever pay for that? Then our plumber, a recovering addict, had a relapse. And in order to pay for a quick drug fix, he removed all the copper pipes from our walls, meaning we'd have to tear everything apart again in order to put in new pipes. How would we pay for that? We got to a very dark place. But it was about much more than money. Our kids learning English created almost as many challenges as it solved, including that one of our new teenagers started speaking harshly to one of our younger kids, which was probably tame compared to the way he'd been spoken to back in the refugee camp, and no doubt reflected some of the anger and loss he was carrying, but it made our younger son feel bullied and unsafe. Unsafe. In our own home. What had we done? We were in way over our heads, but God, who'd been so present early on, seemed to have felt called to another ministry. What had we done to ourselves? What had we done to these 3 new teenagers who we were obviously inadequate to serve? And maybe the question that grieves us the most, what had we done to our first 3 kids? After years of teaching them to love and trust Jesus, when it was just the 3 of them, we realized that the lesson they'd take away from our family now was, don't take risks to follow Jesus, because he'll just hang you out to dry. Spiritually, Michelle and I were holding on by a very thin thread, filled with grief, fear, and anger at God. I kept calling back to those irrefutable initial signs as evidence that we'd not gotten lost by ourselves. God had led us here. And we felt like suckers for going along with it. I felt like Jeremiah after he'd followed the Lord into a dark valley of his own and prayed bitterly, "You misled me." And I allowed myself to be misled. Have you ever felt like that? That you followed Jesus right off a cliff? Often we assume that if we or someone else is in a dark valley, it must be the result of some sin. And often that's true, because sin often carries natural consequences that show why God declared that to be sin in the first place. The Lord was trying to protect us from getting hurt, like parents telling a toddler not to touch something hot. Gossiping, lying, stealing, or mistreating people may lead us where we never wanted to go. So most times we end up in a dark valley because we neglected to follow God. But sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes following God is what gets us there. You resolved not to embellish at work, so you got passed over for the job or the promotion by someone who did. You committed to God's guidelines for sexuality, and it got you dumped. You put God's values over your parents, so you married someone who didn't meet their expectations for ethnicity or worldly success, and now they won't even talk to you. So your holidays are filled with sadness. You tithed and gave generously the way God told you to, but now you can't afford something good that you really want. Early in our careers, Michelle and I were invited to go on vacation with Christian friends who worked in much more lucrative jobs, but we missed out on the fun because we couldn't afford it. Their friendships deepened during that trip, and Michelle and I were always on the outside after that. Speaking of friends, all of this reminds me of Mother Teresa's famous quip, "Lord, if this is how you treat your friends, it's no wonder you have so few." People prefer to talk about God leading us out of dark valleys. That's what makes this psalm so beloved. But what about when God leads us into dark valleys? Can we have a conversation about that? Now, I know that some of you feel uncomfortable that I'm even suggesting that God might do something like that. But we see it a bunch of times in the Bible, besides just Jeremiah, including David, the author of the Psalm 23 we've been reading. David, who followed God multiple times into loss, into loneliness, into fear for his life. But one of the clearest examples of this is when Jesus insisted that his disciples get into a boat and row across the lake without him. But it turns out that Jesus sent them straight into a storm. Why would Jesus do that? And given all of this, how do we make sense of David's claim that he guides me along right paths? Had God guided David along the right path as a child when it put him on the front line against Goliath? Or when David had to hide in a cave to avoid being killed by a crazed king that David could have easily defeated, but was commanded not to by God? Had Jesus' disciples been guided along the right path when it led them into a storm? Had Jesus guided Michelle and me along the right path when it plunged our whole family into a dark valley? In those moments, my emotions scream no, but my experience says yes. All of us prefer the so-called mountaintop moments when God feels so close. It's like you could reach out and touch him. Mountains have that quality for some reason. There's a special mountain where I've had that experience. It's in a ski resort out west where my aunt and uncle owned a house when I was younger. Every few years, I go back there. And when I do, I always go up to a particular peak by myself, take off my skis, and just sit there for a couple of hours. Over the years, I've had some especially important prayer times on that mountaintop. What is it about mountains? Part of it, I think, is that you're so far above the world below. So all the people and buildings that normally seem so big now seem like tiny ants from that perspective. Maybe they aren't as big as I make them out to be. Maybe that person's opinion isn't as important as I made it out to be. On the ground, certain houses or cars seem so much more bigger or more beautiful than others, so much better than mine, perhaps. But from the mountaintop, they look curiously similar. Why would I think one would magically make me so much happier than another? People and things that seem intimidating or important on the ground seem trivial from a few thousand feet up. It's like I can finally see their true size. And there's more to it than that. From that mountain peak, I can see for hundreds of miles and hundreds of other mountains. I see lakes and trees and blue sky that extends endlessly in every direction. I feel the warmth of the sunshine on my face and no sound at all. The noise and distractions down below can't reach that far. These mountains look immovable, but I imagine God shaping them playfully with his fingertips like a child playing with Play-Doh. As Paul said it, it's like I can see God's power and passion for beauty by marveling at what he's created. That's how mountaintops feel to me. But valleys are the opposite. They're dark. You can't see anything beyond your immediate surroundings. But let me make sure you're picturing the right thing. Some valleys are verdant oases between mountain peaks. These are the places where one finds green pastures and quiet waters. Ideally, these are the places that most of our lives are lived. We find nourishment and security there. We may visit the mountaintops occasionally, but no one lives up there. We live down in the valley. But that's not the kind of valley David is describing. He's talking about the kind of dark valleys, where almost nothing grows because the sun rarely reaches there. An arid place where there is no water until a rainstorm strikes, and instead of offering refreshment, it creates a raging river that threatens to rip you downstream and drown you. In dark valleys, you may get glimpses of the sun shining on others, but it never reaches you. The geography of Israel created lots of ravines like that, where a sheep could get lost and have little chance of escape. It's a cold, lonely place. A place where death seems to be waiting for you around every corner and you can't see any way out. That's the kind of valley David is talking about. A spiritual place that feels dry, dark, and dangerous. Hopeless. You see the sun shining on others, but it never reaches you. You're certain you're going to die there, and no one will even know. We feel so alone. And yet, lots of people go there. Almost all of us have been there. Anyone who's ever experienced depression, despair, divorce, the death of a loved one, the death of a relationship or a dream. Anyone who's experienced those things knows what it's like to stumble into the dark valley. You know how lost you feel there. And it's so dark that you can't see any way out. It's so dark, you can't even see God. But here's what David learned from his many trips through the dark valley. God can see you. A sheep bleeding helplessly in a dark valley has no idea where it is. But the shepherd who hears that bleeding and knows the contours of that dark valley like the back of his hand knows exactly where that sheep is and how to lead the sheep out of that ravine. Because, as David discovered about God in those moments, even the darkness will not be dark to you. Everything about Psalm 23 is beautiful and true, but this verse, I suspect, is why it's so popular and beloved, because it captures a truth that so many of us have experienced but struggle to describe. God meets us in the darkness. For many years at High Rock, I led a class during which participants were asked to chart their spiritual lives in the style of those medical charts you see in cartoons. When did you feel like you were growing and flourishing spiritually? And when did you feel like you were withering and dying? Then I asked them to share with the group the pivot points. What happened to change the trajectory from increasing emptiness to increasing fullness of life? And here's what I discovered. At least 95% of the stories started in a dark valley. The dark valley is the place where so many people have met God in a way that transformed their lives and filled them with life. As David wrote after one of his experiences in a dark valley, the Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. I've experienced that same thing, so much so that I used to think that God is closer to the brokenhearted. Like God only shows up when the stuff hits the fan. But now I'm convinced that God is always with us, everywhere, on the mountaintops, the valleys, and the plateaus in between. God never leaves us or forsakes us. What happens is that we forsake God. Like sheep, we go astray. Our attention drifts. When the sun is shining and the grass is green, we don't feel as much need for the shepherd. So instead of listening for his voice or keeping an eye on him so that we don't get lost, we follow our appetites to the next clump of delicious grass. Next shiny new toy that I want to buy, the next promotion, the next achievement, the next opportunity for attention and applause, the next pleasure I'd like to experience. We follow our appetites right into the ravine. Maybe we actively sinned, or maybe we just stopped paying attention so we don't notice when God is leading us in a new direction. We didn't follow. We were happy to stay a little longer where we were, unaware of the danger that the shepherd may have been trying to save us from. But once we're stuck in the dark valley, we start looking desperately for God. C.S. Lewis wrote insightfully, "Pain insists on being attended to. God whispers in our pleasures, but God shouts in our pains." I know what Lewis means, but my experience is that God doesn't speak to me anymore in the dark valleys. It's that I listen more in the dark valleys, because suddenly I'm afraid. Spiritual maturity, including what we think of as spiritual disciplines like daily patterns of prayer, Bible reading, small groups, and Sunday worship, are simply ways we learn to pay attention to God when we're not in the dark valleys, so that maybe we won't end up there as often. But we'll still go there sometimes, because sometimes passing through a dark valley is the only way from one green pasture to another. However, in the moment, the darkness can keep us from seeing what God may be doing. Killing Goliath, but not killing corrupt King Saul, ended up giving David's eventual kingship a stature and spiritual vitality that was unmatched by any of Israel's kings. God led David through a dark valley because it was the only way to the mountaintop on the other side. And the reason the Gospels record the story of Jesus sending the disciples into the storm is because Jesus ended up meeting them in the middle of that storm. And although they'd been following Jesus for a while already, that night they saw Jesus' power in a way they'd never seen before as he walked to them on the water and calmed the storm with a command. That's when they started to realize who he really was. It was a transformational moment that would never have happened if they'd been hanging out on the mountaintop the whole time. Why do I keep repeating the same old stories about my broken back, our difficult early years of marriage, our difficulty having kids, and our desperate financial situations? Because those are the moments when I've encountered God most profoundly, in the places that I didn't even realize God could be. Likewise, David learned that God is not only with us in the dark valleys, even if we can't see it, but that God saves us in those dark valleys. And here in Psalm 23, David describes two ways that God does that. Now remember that David had been a shepherd for many years, so he knew how to rescue sheep using the two tools shepherds carried in that culture, a rod and a staff. The rod was used as a weapon to ward off predators like wolves and lions. The relatively weak and vulnerable sheep could rest comfortably in the wilderness, knowing that the shepherd was watching over them to protect them from threats. As I sometimes feel vulnerable to modern-day predators like critics, cancel culture, our inept politicians, and the evil one who prowls around looking for someone to devour, I'm comforted by the shepherd's club. I see some Christians who get all worked up about the dangers around us or the demons around us. But if I stay near the shepherd, I don't need to worry about those things. I can let him do that. The time I need to worry is when I've wandered far from the shepherd. That's when I'm most vulnerable. So my anxiety there is justified. But the solution is not for the sheep to learn how to conquer a lion alone, as if that could be possible. It's to return to the shepherd, who can keep us safe despite the hungry lions. But as Pastor Wald pointed out in the first week of this series, the biggest danger from which the shepherd needs to protect sheep is themselves. Because they're not nearly as smart as they think they are, and they often follow their appetites into disaster, just like we do. So the second tool the shepherd carries is the staff, which is a long pole with a hook on the end that can be used in two ways. The shepherd can use the rounded back of the hook to gently bonk a disobedient sheep on the head to get its attention before it wanders into danger. If that doesn't work, the shepherd can use the hook to pull the sheep back when it's going in the wrong direction. And finally, when the sheep strays anyway and falls into a ravine, the shepherd can hook the staff around its waist and lift it out of the pit. David is comforted because he knows that, like he did as a shepherd, God can protect us from outside threats and rescue us even when we do something stupid and get stuck. So what can we do with all this? at least two things. First, last Sunday, Pastor Megan pointed out that no matter how unique and independent we like to imagine ourselves to be, all of us are following someone or something. We're following the crowd, a celebrity, an ideology, a cultural trend that influences us more than we usually recognize. The problem is that in most cases, we're being led to places we don't actually want to go and aren't good for us, even if they feel good along the way. By contrast, the Lord is the good shepherd who lays down his life for us and leads us to full life that lasts forever. Jesus is the way to God. Following Jesus doesn't always feel good, but it's always for our good. As David discovered, God may not be leading us on the most popular or immediately appealing path, but he always leads us on the right paths, the ones that lead us where we most want to go, but couldn't get there on our own. The older we get, the truer most of us realize that is. So the first thing I suggest is that we pay attention to our good shepherd so we don't get lost in the first place. As you're enjoying that green grass and quiet water, look up regularly to see where God is so that you can make sure to follow him when he's ready to lead you to the next green pasture. And the easiest way to do this is by creating spiritual rhythms that help you look up regularly. Morning prayer or the evening examen, daily Bible study, or joining Pastor John and me for daily devotions, a weekly small group, and Sunday worship. There are so many other great ideas that you can find on our website, but find a pattern that fits your personality and circumstances. Because like setting aside regular meal times keeps your body nourished, setting aside regular intervals to look for God can keep our souls nourished. Secondly, when you are in a valley, don't despair. Most of pastoral counseling is encouraging people who are in dark valleys to keep following Jesus. Don't give up. Don't go backward. I get it. You can't see Jesus in the darkness, but Jesus will find you there, just like Jesus has found me there every time I've been in the dark valley. Jesus is there already. You just need to quiet the anxious voices in your head long enough to listen for his voice. And when you hear it, through scripture, prayer, or wisdom from trusted Christians, obey whatever he tells you. And I'm saying this because Jesus' instructions may seem impossible and the opposite of what your feelings are telling you. Things like, forgive that person. Receive God's forgiveness for you. Keep that commitment. Release your fierce grip on that dream or demand for your future. Tell the truth, even if it's costly. Tithe, even when money is tight. Share with someone in need. Love your enemy. Resist temptations that promise a shortcut to fulfillment, but are actually the most direct route even deeper into the darkness. I found that Jesus' instructions sound ridiculous when I'm in the valley, but I've also found that it's the only way back to the green pasture. Years ago, I learned a simple hymn that has been a refrain for me in the dark valleys and helped me follow Jesus back into the light. I sing it to fortify my faith when my faith is almost gone. It goes, trust and obey. For there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. I've sung that to myself 1,000 times, and we'll sing it later in this service. Because every time I have found it to be the way out of the darkness. The dark valley is where we change. The dark valley is where we grow. The dark valley is where we can learn to let go of the things that are dragging us down so that we can grab onto Jesus instead. No one likes going down into a dark valley, but many of us are so thankful for what we found there. When my back was broken, when our marriage was broken, when our house was broken, when our family seemed broken. So many times, when I've been back in that dark valley, I found that God was there, waiting for me, eager to lead me to green pastures and quiet waters that I didn't even know about. And I keep talking about those events because I've seen God more clearly in those dark valleys than I have from the sunny mountaintops. I've seen God's miraculous power to provide and His amazing grace. I continue to believe that Michelle and I followed Jesus into adoptions that were difficult for all of us involved. Other times, following Jesus has led me into difficult conversations or circumstances. Following Jesus has led me and people close to me into storms and dark valleys, even recently. But those first 3 kids I worried about now all follow Jesus, despite the dark valleys that we walked through. And maybe because of them. Because they learned alongside us that God doesn't simply wait for us on the mountaintops. God comes to find us in the dark valleys. And if we follow Him there, He can lead us to green pastures we couldn't have found on our own. Sometimes a dark valley is the only way to the mountaintop on the other side. So trust and obey. Usually, it's our sin that gets us stuck. But as we've seen, sometimes Jesus will lead you into a storm or dark valley, not out of malice, but out of love. Jesus wants to heal you and reveal Himself to you. Regardless of how you got there, the only way through is to trust and obey. Because there's no other way to be happy in Jesus than to trust and obey.